Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll get started in just a minute or two. We'll give people a couple of moments to arrive. Bonjour, bonjour, Ben.
Bonjour, Alan.
We're rolling in now. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. We'll give it just one more minute and we'll get started. Thanks for being on time. Great to see all of you. Okay, I'll continue to let people in as they arrive. Here we go. One more. Let's let her get settled. Okay, bonjour, bonsoir tous. Welcome to our MLF America special event, a conversation directed at heads of school with an open invitation to all those interested. Big ideas, big questions aren't limited to heads of school. So thanks for being here. In just a moment, I'll pass the mic to Pierre Pouget, professor at Audi International School and MLF America executive director in his first year. A few logistics for our time together. We have just 1 hour. It's going to go quick. It's short. So we need your assistance in working efficiently. We'll have approximately 45 minutes of presentation and about 15 minutes of Q&A, give or take a little bit. So please stay muted and drop any questions into the chat. And those questions will go to Pierre and I, and we'll make some choices based on time and content about the questions to feed to our presenters. And so we'll handle the questions at the end, but feel free to drop those in the chat throughout the presentation. And with that, I think I'll pass it to Pierre, who will introduce the session and introduce our presenters.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, welcome everybody. Welcome, dear colleagues. Welcome, Oma and Will. Thank you to be with us tonight. So yeah, I've just lived through 2 challenging school years, and you and your teams have taken an incredible challenges that have profoundly reshaped our vision of education. And today we are at a crossroads in a number of subjects. So as always, our MLF America network provides support to its members while being in the same process of projecting as a network into its own future. And our members know that in the 27th of October, we're going to work on that future. And to support us in our reflections, we are proposing you this special event today in the form of an exchange with Oma and Will from the Big Question Institute. I think the presentation is going to be quick because we don't have a lot of time first, and a lot of you are knowing already the Big Question Institute that regroup educators, coaches, futurist parents, and passionate learners, and was created to help educators and others build their capacity to see and accept this moment for what it is, and to peer into the future with skill. So Oma, the author of Growing Up Global, more than 20 years of experience working for governments in a lot of countries, in a lot of continents, and with a lot of experience on that situation. And Will, who was a former public school educator during, I think, more than 22 years, author of six books, working in 30 countries, almost all the continents except for Antarctica, and recognized by all our profession as one of the most interesting leader in that thinking about the future of education. So no more for me. Welcome everybody, and I give the floor to Will or to Oma to begin that session.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, for that really kind introduction. And thanks, Ellen, as well, for the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with you tonight. I am still trying to get to Antarctica. If you have any connections down there, please let me know, because I'd love to make that trip. So we do have a really short amount of time considering the enormity of this moment, right? We could probably spend days talking about what's happening right now and what it means for education. So we're going to cover a lot of ground in 45 minutes. It's going to be a lot coming at you, but we want to take advantage of the time that we have, because we think that there is just a lot, obviously a lot to interrogate. I mean, we are the Big Questions Institute, and we are asking questions about this moment and what the future means, not just for education, certainly, but for the world and for humanity. So we're going to pace through this presentation pretty quickly, and it's going to be recorded. I don't know, it is being recorded, so that you'll probably be able to go back and look at the slides and listen to it a little bit more carefully if it's a little quick tonight. But we do want to make sure that we leave at least 10 minutes or so for some conversation at the end. So anyway, that's kind of the tee up of that. We're going to just start by talking about what our thesis is, what our belief here is, and to us, a lot of this is simply about decision making. It's about the choices that we make, and to really create the best learning environments we can for our students in schools right now. We just feel that we have to be well informed and realistic about what the current situation in the world is right now and what might be coming next. And that to do that, we have to bring dispositions of truth telling, of exploration, and of hope. Obviously, there are many other kinds of frames and headspaces that we need to be in right now. But what we're going to do tonight is this. We're going to tell some truths. We're going to try to explore some of these contexts and some of these realities right now. And then hopefully we're going to end on a note of hope, because we think, obviously, we need to maintain hope, and that we need to carry that with us into the future. So that's just briefly where we're coming from. And I'm going to turn it over to Homa, who will pretty much just start us off into talking about these new contexts that we find ourselves in right now. So Homa.
Okay, thanks, Will. And I will echo my gratitude to Ellen, Pierre, MLF. We're really happy to join you. And particularly as you have a global vision, we really think it is vital as we move forward in what is going to come next in education to be honest and aware of the context that we're living in. So I'm going to go through them very quickly. We could spend a lot more time diving into how every single one of these mega contexts that I'm going to just touch on can impact who we are in schools and what we do. And so, no question, the starting point context at this moment is the pandemic that we're living through. And it's upended our lives. It's made us more I think, connected as a planet. We're all going through this. And at the same time, so many dysfunctions, so much brokenness has also come to the surface. Excuse me. And as we're going through this pandemic, there has been this emergence of awareness about a twin pandemic, really that 400-year epidemic of racism, that we are clear that what became clear after the video of the murder of George Floyd surfaced last spring, was that this wasn't just an American problem. This really is a global, universal movement that we must center in our deliberations if we are to move forward with relevance. And we really think about relevance, justice, and sustainability as the vision and the goal for schools. So while this movement for Black lives has emerged as a sort of twin pandemic, twin epidemic that we must pay attention to, simultaneously, now we are experiencing a backlash in a lot of places. That's something to understand, to take into account. The economic inequality worldwide, we cannot ignore. It is having implications on so many, from, in the United States, kids having to go to a McDonald's parking lot just to be able to access the internet, or around the world, the sort of this breaking of the foundations, because we cannot ignore this depth of inequality anymore. Likewise, around the world, we are seeing really democracies are fragile, that in many places it feels that advances that were made are now under siege. And that is connected to another phenomenon we're really paying attention to, that we're calling the infodemic. It is a crisis of truth and trust and information. How do we know what is the truth in our digital lives? How do we teach that? How do we discern? And then, this grand existential crisis of climate, really a climate catastrophe that none of us can avoid, regardless of the privilege that we may have. It may help us to purchase air conditioning or whatever it might be, but we are really all impacted by all of this. And then as we look to these external macro issues, there also are these profound topics of mental health and wellness that we can no longer ignore, we can no longer run away from. And so as we take all of this into account, and we both realize it is a lot, it's a lot to take in, we really appreciate the wisdom of Adrienne Maree Brown, who is the author of Emergent Strategy. And she clarifies this idea that as we look at this global landscape, remember this: things are not getting worse, but they are getting uncovered. And so what do we do in the face of this? It's like this massive uncovering. We must be there for each other. We must hold each other tight and continue to pull back the veil, continue to tell difficult truths so that we can confront them. And what feels new now is this unveiling, especially if we have lived in relative privilege, that we cannot ignore anymore. This unveiling is for all to see. The heaviness is the increasing weight of the truth becoming undeniable as more people believe this truth and these many truths that have really been uncovered. And so as schools, what we've noticed is that what's been uncovered is that in many ways, schools were built for a world that simply does not exist anymore. And that is something that's become, I think, really clear in these past couple years. And so, we think about our 20th century model of education, the factory model, and we step back and we say, you know what, it's not 1919 anymore. even though we probably can recognize many of the structures of school, maybe not all of them at your school, but many of them are very recognizable from 1919, but pushing us even further, and we share this a little bit tongue in cheek, but it's not even 2019 anymore. So much is changing. And, you can look at a picture from 2019 and notice, wow, we lived in a really different reality in many ways at that time. And so as we step back to look at this sort of panorama of issues, we want to ask you a big question. Which of these is not a problem of education? So which was not caused by a lack of understanding, of deeper empathy, of deep understanding? And likewise, which of these will not be solved by education? Are we preparing our students to confront this incredibly challenging landscape that is ahead of us? And we really align with this thinking of Zachary Stein, who talks about this idea that the task of education today is to confront the almost unimaginable design challenge. And we at the Big Questions Institute really think about this epic design challenge that we are confronted with, of building an education system that provides for the recreation of civilization during a world system transition. Like, it's huge, it's very ambitious. This challenge brings us face to face with the importance of education for humanity and the basic questions that structure education as a human endeavor. So stepping back, looking at this big picture, it is nothing short of the recreation of civilization during this transition that our world is going through. What if we were to see our students as civilization builders? What would change? And another frame that's really helped us in our thinking since the beginning of the pandemic, Pierre has heard this many times already, is this article from Arundhati Roy. At the very beginning of the pandemic, it was published in the Financial Times. And she brought this framework that the pandemic, or this metaphor, this pandemic is a portal. And she explains it like this, that historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. So this pandemic that we're in is not different from those historic pandemics. Consider it like a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. And so the choice is at the heart of this portal. We can choose to walk through the portal, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or this is the choice. We can choose to walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for that other world. And so it is a really critical choice. What matters so much? And we're going to talk about this a little bit. What is sacred about schools that we want to ensure that we carry with us through the portal? And let's make sure we leave some things behind. And so as we kind of navigate this portal, right now, we really see us being in this in-between state, that we're in between stories, that our old stories are breaking. We have an opportunity to write new ones. And this is something that anthropologists have coined as a liminal state. And what liminal means, it's basically at a threshold. It's barely perceptible oftentimes. And it really is about this in-between transitional moment. And there are many ways that you can think about liminality. It came up a few months ago as we have been thinking about the future and what liminality means. This article came up in the Harvard Business Review thinking about organizational change. And the authors talk about how liminal experiences are disturbing and disruptive, as we have seen, but they also represent potent opportunities for reflection, discovery, and even reinvention. And that is where some of the hope lies. So, there are many, you can think of adolescence or going off to college, or many life transition experiences that put us in a liminal state. And even on a grand societal level, some philosophers, anthropologists, organizational scientists, they see us now as we were in an axial age that this sort of epic portrait conveys, that right now we are at this hinge moment. Consider like an axis, a pivot, and there are many choices ahead of us. They may feel very dramatic or not, but what if we were to operate as if we are in this pivotal time together? And we think that there are some key dispositions that help us, guide us through, it is a little bit like this explorer who has some good equipment, they're trained, but they are going into new territory. They are going to shine a light on the darkness and enter into this cave to see what's next. And in a way, that's us. This is a time to, wear this gear. And what we need now, as this quote from John Hagel says, we need narratives of explorers rather than narratives of true believers. There's just so much we don't know. And it's about emphasizing the opportunity to learn and grow by constantly framing new questions. This is where fearless inquiry comes in. And as we are going on these quests, the focus is on the possibilities to be discovered rather than going back to those certainties to be recovered. There's a lot we're not going to recover right now. And that may be hard to embrace and accept. I think that's part of this really difficult transition that we do want to acknowledge. It has been hard, it's been exhausting, it's been overwhelming, but how do we move forward? And so we do think there is this stance, this disposition of inquiry. We don't come in with all the answers, but we do want to have that courageous, open, curious, optimistic, hopeful, I'd say hopeful more than optimistic, disposition of fearless inquiry. And one of the really important elements of fearless inquiry is truth telling. So I'm going to turn it over to Will to go into that a little more.
So there is a lot to deal with here. There's no question about that. And a lot of it is new. A lot of it has come upon us in the last 10 years, 20 years. Obviously, the internet in 20 years has changed so much of our lives and continues to impact us in ways that we don't fully understand yet, and that we don't know even what's going to come around the corner next. But a lot of these truths have been around, when you look at education, have been around for a long time. And so I want to dive into some of these hard kind of conversations around learning in schools that we don't really talk about very much, but that now are even more important for us to have. They're more important for us to begin to discuss and to, again, interrogate. So I want to start with this idea of learning. And I want to ask this question, what do you mean by learning? And the point here is that learning is the focus of our work. And so one of the questions that we ask, as you'll see, is how do you define it? How do we define it? And is there coherence in our school communities as to what learning is and how we approach it in our classrooms? The author of this book, Seymour Saracen, who is just a brilliant thinker about education, in this book, he says that it's kind of interesting that when we ask educators, and we've been doing this, and I've been doing this for 5, 6, 7 years now, what is interesting is that it's hard. It's a hard question to answer. You would think it would be somewhat easy and accessible for educators, especially who deal with learning all the time. But in most of the places that we go, and when we talk to educators, when we talk to leaders, if we ask 10 different people what their definition of learning is, how they define it, we'll get 10 different answers. And there's very little coherence in school communities around that, what that is. And we just really believe that right now we need coherence when it comes to the way we think about learning, and that we have to think about it in its most natural, essential terms. Just so you know, Saracen's definition, I think, is pretty provocative and accessible. He says, productive learning is where the process engenders and reinforces wanting to learn more. And he says, absent wanting to learn, the learning context is unproductive. And I think, again, if we all kind of checked in right now and asked ourselves, what are the things that we have learned most powerfully and deeply in our lives? They are absolutely things that we have wanted to learn more about. And those things that we maybe have come into touch with or contact with, and we don't really want to learn more about them, we probably don't remember much about those things, and we don't really want to pursue them or give any intellectual energy toward them. And so this is kind of an interesting question to ask kids. Do you want to learn more about the things that are happening in school? It's kind of a scary question in many cases to ask kids. Now, there's this dissonance in schools, and it's kind of under the surface always when we think about learning, because all of us know that learning is one of the most natural things that we do. We do it from the first breath that we take. We do it up until the last breath that we take. We can't help learn. We can't help but to learn. That's how humans evolve. We are constantly learning. So it's one of the most natural things that humans do. The problem is that schools aren't natural places for learning. They are constructs. And to take this very natural thing that we do and then put it in this unnatural space causes all sorts of problems and questions. And they are raised, I think, most eloquently by a woman named Carol Black in an essay called 1,000 Rivers. And you can find this essay very easily. Don't go read it now, but at some point, please take the time to read through this. I'm going to read a bit of a long excerpt from this essay, and then kind of a mic drop quote at the end that I think really just distinguishes this or clarifies this dissonance that we're all kind of feeling about learning. She goes, any wildlife biologist knows that an animal in a zoo will not develop normally if the environment is incompatible with the evolved social needs of its species, but we no longer know this about ourselves. We have radically altered our own evolved species behavior by segregating children artificially in same-age peer groups instead of mixed-age communities, by compelling them to be indoors and sedentary for most of the day, by asking them to learn from text-based artificial materials instead of contextualized real-world activities, by dictating arbitrary timetables for learning rather than following the unfolding of a child's developmental readiness. And common sense should tell us that all of this will have complex and unpredictable results. And then here is this really powerful quote that I think gives us all pause when we hear it for the first time. Collecting data on human learning based on children's behavior in school is like collecting data on killer whales based on their behavior at SeaWorld. We are trying to have children experience something that's very natural to them in a context, in a construct that is unnatural in many ways. And it is problematic at its core. It is a fundamental dissonance in the ways that we do school. And we've always just kind of not talked about that. Most places don't, most people in education don't go there, but we know it. We know it. I've been asking this question. We've been asking this question now too, since we started the Big Questions Institute a couple of years ago. But when we go and engage in discussions about, what are the conditions for deep and powerful learning to occur in our lives? And if you're thinking about that question right now, some words or some ideas are probably popping to mind. The kind of amazing thing is that everywhere that we've gone, just about everybody that we've asked, the answers are really consistent. And they are these pretty much, that deep and powerful learning requires conditions that, it's relevant to people's lives, that it's somewhat fun. That's not to say it's always fun, but that, sometimes it's hard fun, that there's autonomy and agency, that it's not constrained by time. It's done for a real audience. I'm not going to read through all these, but I think My guess is you're looking at this list and kind of nodding your heads and going, yeah, these are the things that basically are required for us, for humans, to learn in deep and powerful ways. But what's equally interesting to me, but not really surprising, is what people never, ever, ever say when we ask them, what are the conditions for deep and powerful learning? No one, educators, no one ever says that a really great condition is, let's put a real big emphasis on grades. That's a great way to get kids to learn. Or that let's not give them any choice or any agency over what happens to them in school. Let's make sure all of it is about handing it in, that it's work that's done for someone else. It's not done for them. And all these other things again. And so this is this kind of really interesting, again, this dissonance that we carry with us around learning. We all say the things on the left, but in most schools that we visit, we're still doing so much of this stuff that's on the right. And it's legacy practice. And it's baked into the narrative of school. But what we're suggesting is it's not sustainable any longer to continue to work on the right-hand side of this slide, because the world now demands that the number one skill that children need to have in this world right now is to be an amazing learner. And the way that you create learners is that you create conditions for deep and powerful learning to happen. So we really think that the most important lesson from the last couple of years is this reminder that deep and powerful learning only happens when it's relevant, real world, collaborative, driven by inquiry. And again, I'm guessing that many of you who are listening to this, if you, again, told the story of your own learning over the last couple of years, you would say, yeah, this is what it looked like. It was all about questions. We had to solve problems on the fly. We did it together. We tried stuff, it failed. It was this kind of amazing, constant learning, urgent learning that we did. But that when we asked you, does that map to the way that your kids are learning in your classrooms? The answer probably is not so much. And that's been our experience when we ask that question of people who have gone through the last couple of years in this very intense kind of, 18 months that we've been in. Now, learning, so there's this dissonance in learning, but then there's also this dissonance around schooling too, and the way that we do school. And I know that, most of us want to get back to normal. We hear this all the time. You can read articles like all over the place about schools, institutions of all types wanting to get back to normal. I mean, given the situation that we're in, all those contexts that Homa talked about, let's just remember, normal is what got us to that point. And so the question becomes, do we really want to go back to the normal ways of doing things that got us to the point that we're in right now? I think normal needs interrogation, and it needs interrogation in schools, and it needs to be a truthful interrogation. So I'm going to run through these very quickly. Some of the normals that we see pretty consistently from school to school, when we talk to kids, when we talk to teachers, leaders, here's some of the normals that most are experiencing in their schools. Number one, it's a curriculum that's forgotten as soon as the test is over. I think, again, if we're honest about it, that's a lot of what happened in our lives when we were in school. I know that's happened to my children, that basically most of it they didn't find very relevant or useful. It's kids learning how to get a good grade over everything else. And school is in many ways set up to be a game that you have to win at. It's a lesson rather than a discovery. It's something that's pre-planned. It's unnatural segregation by age. It's chunks of time that interrupt the flow of learning. It's inequitable access in many cases to modern learning tools or to the literacies that are required for those tools. It's these silos of knowledge that rarely connect. It's about surveillance and privacy issues more and more, especially in the last couple of years since we've had to go online. That's been a major issue right now. It's an emphasis on teaching, not learning. And when you look at a lot of the professional development lineups that schools have, it really is focused on how do we do what we're doing better, not how do we really look at learning and try to make sense of it in terms of how our practice in classrooms. As I said, it's a lack of relevance. It's more about white male explorers, scientists, authors, and histories than anything else. We do not have a very diverse set of voices in our curriculum or diverse sources. It's about kids, as Homa mentioned, who are increasingly anxious, depressed, and stressed. All of the studies show that that was increasing before the pandemic, and the pandemic has accentuated that. It's an increasing illiteracy to recognize misinformation or disinformation. Its self-worth is measured by numbers. It's power over as opposed to power with. And it really is that the quality of education is dependent on your wealth in many cases, if not most cases these days. And so the question becomes, why do we want to go back to those things? Why do we want to return to those normals? Now, we're not going to go back, first of all. That normal basically was, again, something that wasn't that great. It got us to this place that we're at right now. And as Sonia Renee Taylor says, we have now the opportunity to stitch a new garment, and one that fits all of humanity and its nature. And this really is now about the collective. It's about humanity. It's not about individual gain or individual access. It's about how do we do work in the world, for the world, with our students. Now, the reality is that normal is already changing in a lot of different ways. And you can look at the narratives around education and you can see that they are under stress right now. We won't say that they're broken, but basically the contexts have put a great deal of stress on what it means to be educated and how you go about getting an education. And there's a lot of tension around this right now. A lot of kids are questioning the status quo when it comes to college. They're asking, do we really need to go to college? Is it worth the money we have to spend to go to college? And are there other ways that maybe we can get to a point where we can be prepared for our life's work, whatever that is? Even educators in the system, in higher ed, are beginning to question what we're doing and whether or not it makes sense given the moment that we're in. So, it is a changing narrative. It's like the traditional education narrative says that you go to school, you play by the rules, you work hard, you get good grades, you ace the test, you go to good college, you get a good job, right? And that education is something that is explicit, it's competitive, it's required. But it's also something that costs a ton of money right now for kids who can't get scholarships. And it is leaving many kids out. We have only 1/3 of people in the United States who actually have a bachelor's degree. And so 2/3 of people right now are without a college degree. So what are those people doing? Well, now increasingly, there is this kind of shifting narrative. And this shifting narrative suggests that we kind of create our own school experience. We develop our own passions. We learn how to learn. We develop skills. That education is tacit. It's impactful, collaborative. It's something that we want, not something that we necessarily have to have. And it's a very interesting shift that's happening. You know this. You know that places like Coursera are now offering thousands of courses. And yes, there are low completion rates. And it's kind of interesting and ironic to me that they're trying to create courses per se in just putting them in a different space so that they can be accessed digitally. But still, there are lots of different ways that you can learn about the things that you want to learn at the moment that you need or want to learn it. Google and others are coming out with certifications that kind of are competing now with a college degree. Lots of corporations are now looking at the world and saying, why do we require a college degree? When there are so many people who don't have one, there has to be a huge amount of talent in that pool. And how do we find those people and basically develop them in our own contexts? You look at people now who are saying one of the things that might be most important in the world for kids to thrive is their ability to create relationships and networks. And so, how many relationships do they have? What's the quality of those relationships? What's the structure of their networks? And how can they mobilize those relationships to learn in the moment that they need to learn? And then finally, or not next to finally, credentials are exploding in the US. We have over 1 million different credentials right now that people can get. And more, these credentials are becoming ones that employers are looking at and saying, yeah, that's a good credential. That doesn't have anything to do with college, but it shows that you have particular skills. And, even on a national level in places like Taiwan and New Zealand and British Columbia, but specifically in Taiwan, education is now not something that's competitive. It's something that's collaborative and cooperative. And it's really about the global citizenry. It's for the collective. They are saying we cannot educate in ways that simply benefit the individual. All education now has to benefit all of humanity. And that we do that through intrinsic motivation, we focus on well-being. And basically, as the country of Taiwan has said, look, sustainability, inclusion, and innovation are the rough consensus across generations of what a lifelong learner should focus on. So let's be clear. The narratives are beginning to change. And that means that we are now going to have to figure out, what do we do? What do we carry forward? What do we leave behind? And how do we come to understand those choices?
So to write this new story, the way forward, finding that we have found, given so much uncertainty and flux in the world, the way forward is through questions. It is through fearless inquiry. And we have tried to capture that in our book. If you haven't had a chance to see it yet, the 9 big questions schools must answer to avoid going back to normal, because normal wasn't that great to begin with. It is available as a free download. We encourage you, share the link. You can get it through this bit.ly link on the screen, or just go to our website, bigquestions.institute. Our intention was to make this as widely available and easy to read. You can read it in a very short time. I'm going to run through the 9 big questions. But we want it to be shared and discussed. And it's been really exciting to see around the world, you know, from a school in Nicaragua that has a big questions day every week for its elementary students to center their inquiries, to many other places. There is power in questions. And this idea that is captured from Peter Block, questions that have the power to make a difference, are the ones that engage people in an intimate way, confront them with their freedom, and invite them to co-create a future possibility. And that's what we really hope, is inviting you to co-create this great design challenge. Approaching it starts with asking good questions, big questions. So I'll just quickly run through, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. Our 9 questions. Our very first question, as I intimated earlier, is what is sacred? And so as much as we're talking about change in the world, in education, being responsive to what is happening, we aren't saying throw everything out. We're saying be really honest about what you care about, what is sacred. Those are the things to carry through the portal. Those are the things to keep and build from. And then what doesn't fall into that sacred is up for debate. You may want to get rid of it. As Will discussed, the question about what is learning. Do we have a shared definition? What about power? How much do we ask questions about power in schools? It is often avoided, but it is a vital question for student agency, for teacher creativity, many, many ways to look at power in a school. Why, and the question, why do we take time to look at what you're doing? Why do we do these things? Do we ever question some of the basic things that just kind of keep getting carried over from one year to the next? Why do we do these things? Next question, who is unheard? And that gets to the heart of, along with power, questions about equity. Those are not sidelined. Those are not silos for a separate conversation. The conversation about equity is central to your mission. It is central to safety and learning. It is central to having a clearer, more full, complete global education. Are we literate? So thinking about all these new literacies, and we're going to touch on that just before we close, but that we do have this sort of urgent need to go beyond the basic literacies that we all grew up with. Next, are we okay? So centering wellness, if we've learned a lesson in this pandemic, it's that we cannot avoid the question of our wellness. And our wellness is the whole person, mental, social, emotional, physical, even you might think about spiritual wellness. But this wellness, who is the person that we are bringing into our schools? Are we connected? So connected with our communities, connected with the wider world? Can learning go beyond the walls of our schools? And then the last question is what's next? And that really is looking to the future. And we've really been informed by futurists in a lot of our work at the Big Questions Institute. So this just kind of gives you a very initial broad taste of the 9 big questions. And, as we think to the future, this is an interesting challenge from Tony Jackson, who some of you may know through his work at the Asia Society. And he talks about what we need is education for a 22nd century. Excuse me. Not to prepare to get us, not to prepare for the 22nd century, but to get us there. It's time to move beyond the 21st century. What will differentiate 22nd century education is its intention to develop in all youth an egalitarian mindset, going beyond the me to the we. If we are to survive as a species, education on a global scale must develop in youth the disposition to act more toward the common good than toward individual gain or group hegemony. Like there really is this sort of existential survival question that our schools also need to be paying attention to. And so I want to leave you with one last idea, that these concepts that I shared, these macro contexts, really do form the new curriculum. And there are so many topics I'm not going to spend time on, but you can look at this list of topics and many more around technology, around justice, around health and well-being. Is that central to the curriculum, not just an after-school club, not just a nice to have, but these are the new literacies. And so we can look at literacy in a new way. And if we are honest, there is this huge challenge that is ahead of us. And that challenge is also a huge opportunity. So like you all, I love languages, I love linguistics, I love to understand the roots of words. And this is really fascinating. If you speak Mandarin Chinese or read it, you know that the word crisis is made of 2 characters. One character is danger, the other character is opportunity. And so often when we think about the crisis that we are navigating through, we're sort of stuck in that place of danger. And this, as well as even the word krisis from Greek, that many Romance languages and English get the word crisis, is to sift and separate the opportunity to rise to the top. And so that is one of the kind of lessons in hope that we want to leave you with. And this idea from Mariame Kaba, another woman of color, movement maker, whose wisdom we have really held on to. And she talks about hope as a discipline. It is a commitment to the future, and it must manifest in action. And so we want to leave you with this idea of hope as a discipline, and have you consider, what will you carry through the portal and what will you leave behind? And then you get to reinvent. What will you create anew? And so this is the challenge for us to explore, to discuss, and we do have some time for questions and discussion. Will and I are easy to reach at the Big Questions Institute, and here's our emails. And we also have an opportunity. We really believe in community and creating a community to learn and discuss and grow. So when you go on our site and you download our book, it will invite you to join this BQI community, which is really in a formulation stage, but there are thousands of people that have joined it who want to be in these generative, meaningful, challenging conversations together. So we're figuring this part out, but there is a lot of opportunity to also learn in community as you have a community, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts as we look to the future and hopefully embrace some of these challenging questions. So thank you so much. And I'll turn it over to Pierre and Ellen if you've gotten any questions. Hi, Lisa.
Yeah, so we don't have any questions in the chat right now, and I assume that because the colleagues were so focused on your all your explanation, and so I'm not going to use that 10 minutes to make my own questions, because you know that at ODI we are big fans of the Big Question Institute, and some of the big questions, and even your proposal about the portal, we are working under that themes, and we have mobilized our teams to work under that. So I'm not going to spend time, and I could ask you a lot of questions. So I'm just going to propose to the colleagues and the people present tonight to unmute themselves and ask the question they want to.
This is Ben. I do have a comment about Taiwan, because I'm actually in Taiwan, and that's relevant for this conversation. This is true that the government and there's a big push for what Will said, but when you visit schools, and I'm fairly new in Taiwan, but I already visited a couple of schools. Private schools will have those collaborative and very interesting way to do it. Though generally speaking, the public expectation is kind of a disconnect from that. Like if you go to regular public school, they emphasize maybe on the academic and kind of old ways to say that. So I think the thread during the presentation was this kind of, when you reinvent yourself, how do you, obviously the young people in schools, they wanted something different, but their parents may not, or they may expect something different. So how do you see this perception or this opposite view on education to be resolved?
So let me just say really fast. I find Audrey Tang, who is the person who is leading up a lot of the conversations around modernizing Taiwan. I find her conversations to be pretty amazing, actually, and a lot of it is aspirational, for sure. But I think what they're trying to do is to rewrite the narrative. And Home and I talk a lot about story. When you talk about how do we begin to shift, how do we begin, and I'm hoping that you can still hear me because it looks like I've frozen up a little bit. Apologies.
Your sound is coming through.
Yes,
It is?
I can
Okay.
hear you.
All right. Sorry about that. How do we begin to rewrite the script, and how do we build capacity in parents to help them understand that a traditional school experience may not be the most effective experience out there right now in terms of preparing kids to thrive in the futures that they are going to be living in. Now, again, we're not suggesting you throw the whole thing out. That's not what we're saying. But we are saying this is the moment to begin to interrogate not just the practice, but the story. What story are you telling? What story are you perpetuating? What story are you selling, in fact? And how might you begin to think differently about that story, given the context, given the moment in which we're living? I think that's probably at the crux of it.
And not to throw cold water on optimism about students, but it's been interesting. We've had some really interesting conversations this week with educators around the world. And sometimes the students are not as willing of a party as we may think, because they have been so trained within a traditional system that it is very scary to try something new. So even students, so I just want to say, like, we have to think realistically that sometimes the students are like, no, I just want to know what's on the test and I want to perform. Like, don't open it up. That is very uncomfortable. So it is, I think there is a leadership of talking about accepting and knowing the discomfort. We are going to sit in our discomfort for a little while. And I think parents kind of hearing that, because they're so concerned about the future for their kids, that they may be like, okay, let's try this. Let's sit in our discomfort, because we're all going to be uncomfortable at first. So I just wanted to add that one point, and I see Eric has had his hand up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Thank you very much, Oma and Will. It's very inspiring, as always. And I'm sure all of us are very excited about what you said, and we were certainly all nodding and say, yeah, we want to do it, we'll do it. I would just like to go back to one thing you said about how can we move from the individual gains to the common good. And it's not really a question, it's more like a comment, because all of this has some impact politically speaking. Because, you know, as much as we are all excited as heads of schools or educators, we don't live on, we live on an island, on Mercer Island here, but yet we cannot do all of these things if, for example, colleges don't buy into that, or ministries of education, politicians, don't see that, because there is an inertia, right? And so our parents want what is the best for their kids, which is for them to succeed, to get into those colleges. I mean, I know that you presented all these new ways to learn, and so we are very excited about that. So my point here is that it's going to take a while for sure, and what seems to be something new becomes sometimes very traditional, easily and quickly. So anyway, as you see, it's not a question, it's more like some comments and trying to move forward on this path.
I think Homa knows what I'm going to say, right? It's interesting that you use the word island, because we've been talking a lot about a Margaret Wheatley idea called islands of sanity. And that really the work of schools right now is to create some islands of sanity in a world that is totally uncertain and very chaotic. And it is because the way she writes about it and talks about it is because we are constrained in what we can do right now. We are. That's the reality. You're right, Eric. And so the focus, or the question becomes, what then do we center here? And we just really, it just resonates with us that wellness and really making sure that we are providing experiences and environments and cultures in schools that are in many ways a safe place to be, where we can remember what it's like to be a good human being, where we act with love and with care and with this understanding of the collective, right? That's the most important work that we can be doing right now. And so, that may include not grading as much, because that's in many ways not a very sane thing to be doing to kids by, pumping them with numbers. It may include carving out more time to reflect, carving out more time to play, carving out more time in the school day to let kids pursue their bliss, not to throw the whole thing out, but to try to create spaces that are kind of these, escapes almost in a good way from all of this chaos that's happening right now. So that might be one way to respond to that, because we are constrained. You're right. You can't change the whole thing right now. It's easier, the reality, the truth, if you really want to change it, it's easier to go build it than it is to change it if you've been in a school for a long, long time. And that's just the reality of it. And a lot of people are doing that, by the way.
We did get a question in the chat from Jacques, and we're having some trouble unmuting him. There he goes. You got it?
There we go. Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so my question is, first of all, thanks so much for providing some generative questions. Certainly, I think inquiries is a super important part of what we do every day at school. So it's very refreshing always to hear that in discussions with school leaders. So where do you recommend that school leaders start as they launch into kind of a deep inquiry-based and generative discussions with their school community, with different stakeholder groups? And how do you, maybe a practical question, but how do you effectively compete with the challenges that of the everyday pull on teachers' time?
Okay, so we have 60 seconds to answer that. So go.
Now you have 50.
I think that it starts with being visible about your commitment to do that, being clear that you are listening and you want to hear a lot of voices. I think a lot of times the backlash that we get to change, innovation, equity work, it's people haven't felt listened to. And I think that listening process that does slow down the pace that we want change to happen, is worth it. It's an incredible investment. We have been working with schools that are creating guiding coalitions of students, parents, staff, faculty. They're not the student body president student. There are a lot of students that you may not hear all the time. And they are doing some of these generative conversations and sort of strategic conversations in a microcosm of the school community, and then sharing it out. So you don't have to have everybody in on every conversation. And I mean, you can use our 9 questions book, starting with the question of what is sacred. Asking your community is an incredible way for people to feel heard. And then answers come to the surface that are really powerfully, I think, unifying. It's really amazing when you have unity to move forward with change. So just that one question can be incredibly unifying. And then, for example, you may want to, have a shared understanding about what learning is or something like that. But those are just a couple ways that I think you can kind of build a coalition, a community, and start with what is sacred to then build from there. That is one approach. But clearly, just a really quick answer.
Thanks, I appreciate that. It's a good starting point, and I would challenge all of my school leader colleagues here to ask that question about your own school, because when I think about that, I think, okay, well, yeah, what is sacred to me, and then what might be sacred to others. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
It's a powerful inquiry. Don't underestimate. It's a deceptively simple question, and it can be really powerful. Parents who are difficult to get on board, ask them that, and it's amazing how supportive they can be once they've explored that question.
Okay, I think we are at the end of our 60 minutes. So I really appreciate that time and your time, Oma and Will. So in the name of MLF America Network and all our colleagues there, I just want to thank you for your work. I think, yeah, I've seen some text in the chat, and people were about the way it was provoking and all the thoughts we have to think about. And it's always a great pleasure and a great time to listening to you, Oma, and we also thank you again. Ellen, do you want to say a last word?
Sure, just thank you. Thank you, Homa. Thank you, Will. Thanks everyone for being here. We'll follow up with the recording. And as Homa and Will said, they're accessible. You can reach them, and we'll make sure you get that information. So just thank you. That's it.
Thanks very much, everyone. Be well.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good
Bye,
night.
everybody. Good to see you all.
Bye.
Bye.